Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Abil Qasim al-Mustafa Muhammad wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Wal-la'natu da'imu ala a'da'ihim ajma'een min al-ana ila qiyam yawm ad-din. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, let's take a moment to recite a salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah. I hope that having gone through these nights of Qadr, all of you guys have been able to benefit from the spirituality that we have been able to gain going through the a'mal of these special nights. I want to make this point, and for those who were listening to the lecture yesterday, I made this point, but because this is a different audience, essentially, I will make this point again, about the nights of Qadr and how someone is supposed to be able to make the best of not just the nights of Qadr in the month of Ramadan in general, but specifically these nights. So usually when we go through these nights of Qadr, we do all of these different a'mal, which is wonderful, and it's important to do them. And at the same time, what we also do is we also build this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the caveat, essentially that one point that people don't pay attention to, is that they assume you're supposed to go through the month of Ramadan. So you're supposed to go through the nights of Qadr and then that's it. And then you carry on with your life. And that is the biggest mistake that we could possibly make. The biggest mistake is to essentially go through the night of Qadr, right, and build this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but not have it translate into your life. And the way it translates into our day-to-day lives are the changes that we're going to bring about in our day-to-day lives. So really, if someone wants to be able to benefit from this month, someone wants to be able to benefit from the nights of Qadr, the way to do that is to take this relation, this faith that we've built, and look into our life and see when is it that we go against this relationship? When is it that we contradict this faith that we have built during these nights? And then to be able to make changes to one's behavior and conduct. And that behavior and conduct can be in any aspect of someone's life. For some people, it might be when it comes to the way they deal with their children. It might be for some people the way they deal with their parents, for example. For some people, it might be a number of different things, right? It might be their dress code, the way they dress, the backbiting that they might do, the lying that they might do, the bad akhlaq that they might have. So for each and every one of us, it's going to be different. But we just want to be careful and make sure shaitan doesn't trick us, because shaitan does trick a lot of people by this. And what he does is he gives you the feeling, he has that good spiritual feeling inside that, yeah, I was going through the nights of Qadr and I had the Quran on my head. But then when the nights of Qadr are over, shaitan would love for you to just go back to doing things the way you were doing things before. And if that's what's going to happen, then that means that this person has not really improved, right? And that means he's not really benefited from the nights of Qadr. So, of course, this is easier said than done. And I personally, I'm not the type of person who would speak of things that are easier said than done, unless I mention that it's easier said than done. But this is one of them. It's easier said than done. Bringing real change to your life is, of course, one of those things that we, it's, like I said, it's easier to talk about it than to actually do it. So it's difficult, and I'm admitting to that. But that's the goal. That's the standard. That's the ideal. That's where we should be headed. Just going through the nights of Qadr, just going through Ramadan is the least benefit that we can take, from the month of Ramadan and from the night of Qadr. Anyone who's essentially alive in the night of Qadr or the month of Ramadan, he walks away with a bunch of good deeds. I mean, if you were breathing in Ramadan, you would walk away with a bunch of good deeds. So that's automatic, right? But that doesn't mean you walked away from the month of Ramadan really taking advantage of it. You take advantage of Ramadan when you build a relationship with God that can then translate into bringing about certain changes in your life. If someone can do that, then yes, they have been able to truly be successful in the month of Ramadan. If not, I can tell you, shaitan will walk away and be happy with what you've done, because he will feel like, on one hand, you have this spiritual feeling, and on the other hand, you didn't really make any changes. He loves that. He loves the fact that you and I would feel like we're growing spiritually, but in reality, we're not, when we don't bring about changes in our day-to-day lives to eradicate haram habits that we have in our lives. All right, so to make that, that's a point that's very near and dear to my heart, and I feel like it's really, really important. Usually we don't really pay attention to a point like that. And because of that, a lot of people go through the month of Ramadan. At the end of the day, the moment Ramadan is over, they go back to doing the same thing that they were doing before. That's not a person who's really benefiting from this month to the extent that they possibly could. Okay, Assalamu alaikum to everyone who has joined. We are glad to have you with us. I'm just going to pull up our the stream on YouTube as well, if I can find it, inshallah, and then we will delve into the tafsir of the surah that we will be covering today. So, the surah that we will be covering today, inshallah, is tafsir of Surah Qalam. By mistake, I mentioned in the last session that we would be doing tafsir of Surah Insan, but this was a mistake on my hand. It was Surah Qalam that we were going to go to, and that was the surah that was in the flyer, essentially. Suratul Qalam, or Surah Qalam, is the 68th surah of the Quran, and it consists of 52 verses, and it was revealed in Mecca. Now, like we do with all of these surahs that we're about to discuss, I want to take a moment to understand the ahadith that we have about the reward of someone who is able to recite Suratul Qalam. And when I go through this hadith that I'm about to share them, that I will share with you, you will see that one of those ways of looking at these ahadith that we talked about in some of our earlier sessions really applies here. We mentioned in some of our earlier sessions that whenever we read hadith, that if you read this surah, then there's going to be this thawab for you. We said that some of our scholars are very skeptical in terms of taking those ahadith in a literal sense, right? So they said, one of the opinions was this, that when the hadith says that if you recite this surah, therefore this thawab is going to be there for you, or this reward or result or effect is going to be there for you. One of the opinions was that essentially what the hadith is saying is that if you recite this surah and you act upon the content, if you take this content and you internalize it, then this effect will be there for you, right? Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, may Allah prolong his life, in Tafsir Namuna, he talks about this, right? Now, he gives the example of Surah An-Nur and the relationships that someone might have with the opposite gender and the boundaries that he sets between himself and the opposite gender. Because we have hadith that when someone recites Surah An-Nur, that he is going to be protected from, for example, adultery, right? From engaging in a deed like that. And he says, this hadith shows you, and that's just one example that he mentions, this hadith shows you that really what the hadith is saying is that if you recite Surah An-Nur, and then you act upon the content in Surah An-Nur, then you will be protected. Why? Because Surah An-Nur, the teachings within it and the topic mainly, or not mainly, but one of the main themes that comes up in it is the issue of the opposite gender and how to approach the opposite gender. So he says, if you take a look at it, every time the hadith says this result, this effect will be there for you, you look at the surah, you find that the effect that the surah is talking about, or the hadith is talking about, and the content within the surah, they're connected. So really what the hadith is saying is that if you take this surah and you act upon it, then that effect will be there for you. So when it comes to Suratul Qalam, you find something very similar. In Suratul Qalam, as we will go through the verses, one of the main verses and one of the most important verses in the surah is a verse in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is referring to the Prophet. He says, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. Your conduct, your akhlaq is wonderful, it's great. And we'll, of course, elaborate on that a whole lot more when we get to that verse. But then in hadith you read from the Prophet salawatullahi alayhi, he says, whoever recites Suratul Qalam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give him the reward of those who have good akhlaq. Again, this understanding that Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi has proposed makes a lot of sense here. That when the Quran says, or when the hadith says that if you recite this surah, this effect will be there for you, what it really means is if you read it and you take it to heart and you internalize it. Right? Because the surah is talking about good akhlaq, act upon it, naturally you will have the reward of someone who has good akhlaq. Again, we have the second hadith I wanted to share with you guys from Al-Imam As-Sadiq salawatullahi alayhi. He says, whoever recites Suratul Qalam in his wajib or mustahab prayers, he will never reach a point where he has to deal with poverty and after he leaves this world, his grave will be illuminating with light. It won't be a dark grave. Okay, so the Imam is explaining that if you recite this surah, then there's going to be this sustenance for you, right? You're not going to have to deal with poverty. Well, when you look at Surah Al-Qalam, the main story in the surah is about a group of people who were deprived by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it came to their sustenance because of certain actions that they did that we will discuss in the story. So again, it kind of gives you this feeling that when this hadith says if you recite the surah, what it means actually is if you recite and therefore act upon the content of the surah. Okay. Having said that, let me just take a look. Assalamu alaikum again to everybody else who has joined. Okay, so I'll start with the just an overview of the surah real quick before we move on to the first verse. This surah was revealed mainly, when I say it was revealed mainly for this purpose, I don't mean this is the only theme in the surah. There's multiple themes in the surah, but the surah was revealed when the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was being accused of having lost his mind, essentially. Okay? And this surah was revealed as a way of comforting the Prophet. That's why the Quran says in a couple of verses we will read, وَمَا أَنْتَ بِنِعْمَةِ رَبِّكَ بِمَجْنُونَ. Right? You're not crazy. You haven't lost your mind. In fact, they are the ones who are lost and they don't know what they're doing in their life. Now, before I delve into the surah, what this really teaches us is that the Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take time out of the Quran, right? And it'll take space out of the Quran to do one very important thing for his Prophet. And that one very important thing that he is going to do for his Prophet is to comfort him. Think about this for a second. For those who were following along with our lectures during the nights of Qadr, I talked about this in detail, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But I'll just say this, that again, this is an example of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showing how important it is to show emotional support for someone who's going through a rough and a tough time. The Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has to hear all these nasty things throughout the day, and they accuse him of multiple things, right? They used to call him a poet, they used to call him a person who's possessed by the jinn, they used to call him someone who's lost his mind and is crazy. They used to call him all these different things, right? They used to say that this Quran is not yours. You know, you go behind the mountains, some priest essentially dictates the content of this book to you. So he's hearing all this stuff, but it's important to understand that the Quran will take time out of its surahs to then comfort the Prophet. And this shows how important the emotional support that you give to somebody is. Because if the Prophet, if a special servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whose faith and anything we could imagine is in need of the emotional support that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to give to him, then you can only imagine what it's going to be like for our family members. You can only imagine what it's going to be like for our own brothers and sisters who, of course, we don't have that type of faith. And that just means we need more emotional support from one another. So this is very critical. How can somebody show emotional support? What are the ways to do it? And what do you have to keep in mind when you're speaking to someone? That's something that we've discussed during the nights of Qadr, and so I won't go over that topic again. But this just highlights the importance of this topic. Not only do you have Surah Al-Qalam revealed for this purpose, you also have Surah Al-Duha revealed for the same purpose. Surah Al-Duha, essentially, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears. He swears by the daytime and He swears by night. وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى مَا وَدَّعَكَ رَبُّكَ وَمَا قَلَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not forsaken you. Why is he talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forsaking him? Why does that matter? Because this is a form of comforting the Prophet. Therefore, this emotional support is very, very important for the Prophet, even more so for people like you and me, whose faith and reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never come close to that of the Prophet. Surah Al-Duha, you find this, and of course the surah that of course is our favorite, not because of all the right reasons, but because it's the shortest surah in the Quran, and because your salat will be over faster if you choose this surah when you're going through your salat. Surah Al-Kawthar is also revealed for the same purpose. Surah Al-Kawthar was revealed as a means of comforting the Prophet when people used to say nasty things to the Prophet. One of them was that you have nobody to represent you, right? And this was a way of humiliating the Prophet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, no, Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. So this highlights the importance of this issue of emotional support. Moving on, let's move on to the first verse because there's quite a bit that we have to discuss. I'm not sure if we will be able to get to the next surah after Surah Al-Qalam, which is Surah Al-Tahrim. But let's see if we have the time to get to that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Noon wal qalami wa ma yasturun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts out with Noon. This is huruf al-muqatta'a. We don't know what these letters are referring to necessarily. And there are different opinions about them. Some say this is code between the Prophet and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some say no, it's just some letters. Some say this is a way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala showing you and me that this Quran that has come about, it has come about through these basic and simple letters that you guys use. You guys use these letters and you just make up normal sentences. We use these letters and we create the Quran. This is, of course, the opinion that I prefer to go with, not because I'm not because I'm an expert in this field or anything like that, but it's just something that I would prefer to go with because it sounds a little bit better and it makes a lot of sense as well, because it really hits home if you think about it. It's like a chef taking normal ingredients, right, like flour and salt and these normal we have, and saying, hey, look at these normal ingredients. With these, you guys make like some basic food, but with these, the same ingredients, I can make like a masterpiece, for example, right? And it really hits home. If you know chefs who are really good at what they do, actually, they usually seem to be using very, very simple, basic ingredients, right? But anyways, I don't know much about that, and I'm not into cooking too much either. When I say I'm not into cooking, doesn't mean I demand, this awesome food either. No, I'm not into cooking. And at the same time, I'm very content with basic food as well, okay? So anyways, having said that, let's move on. Noon wal qalami wa ma yasturun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears by the qalam. What is the qalam? The qalam refers to this pen. Mufassirin have had a discussion as to what is this qalam referring to? What pen is it referring to? The opinion that we're going to go ahead with, which is the mainstream opinion here, is that it's referring to this pen that we have. وَمَا يَسْتُرُونَ, and those things that this pen writes, or those who write with this pen, who some say refer to the angels, some say no, it refers to the general idea of how the human being uses qalam, how the human being uses the pen. The role of the pen as it relates to Quran and Hadith is a very critical one. Okay, you find that at the beginning of Revelation, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was revealing the first surah of the Quran, which we know to be Surah Al-Alaq, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala touches on the idea of the qalam. We say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came to the Prophet through the angel Jibreel, told him Iqra. So the first command that he gave him was to read, right? And then as those verses continue, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqal insana min alaq, Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram, alladhi allama bil qalam, right? You remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you read with his name, the one who taught the human being through al-qalam. They taught the human being through the writing that the human being is able to do. So qalam carries a lot of weight and value from the Islamic perspective because it is the way through which you can take knowledge and you can pass it on over time and over ages. Now, I want to share one hadith and then I want to go into the role that qalam has played in Islamic history and how that has made Islam essentially different from every other religion that we have out there in the world. This qalam plays a very, very big role, and I want to talk about it a little bit more. So the first hadith I want to share is a very beautiful one. This one really was, one of the most interesting ahadith I've heard in a long time. It says, ثَلَاثٌ تَخْرُقُ الْحُجُبِ. There are 3 sounds that will break through the barriers وَتَنْتَهِي إِلَى مَا بَيْنَ يَدَيِ اللَّهِ. And they will make their way towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears everything. But what the hadith is saying is that these 3 sounds are so close and near and dear to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that it's as if they break through the barriers and they make their way to the 7th heaven, right? To the arsh of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, what are these 3 sounds that are so special? What are these 3 sounds that really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying they are so near and dear to me? If they are anywhere, I will hear them. He says the first one of them, صَرِيرُ أَقْلَامِ الْعُلَمَاءِ. The sound it makes when a person of knowledge is taking his pen and he's writing with that pen. You know that back in the day, the pens that they used to use, right, was of wood, and certain types of wood. And when you would write with this wood on whatever it is that you were writing on, maybe it would have been leather, maybe it would have been on a bone, right? Maybe it would have been on a number of different things, right? When you were writing on this on this paper, for example, you would find that this pen would make a certain noise as you're moving and as you're curving going about the letters. That certain noise that it makes. The hadith says the sound of that pen writing with the ink that you would put on it is the first sound that makes its way through the barriers and goes all the way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how valuable it is. The sound of the pen of the scholars. And when the hadith says ulama, it's not necessarily only religious scholars. It's ilm, it's knowledge, right? So it would refer to basically any type of holy knowledge. So that's the first one. That shows how beautiful it is. And really, if you think about it, like these great scholars that we've had, the likes of Allama Tabatabai, imagine he was sitting somewhere in his house in the city of Qom. And it's interesting, what most people don't know, Allama Tabatabai, even during his life, he was not well known. Like, people didn't even know about him, right? Even among scholars, he was the type of person who was considered like a normal scholar. He wasn't considered, to be, well, I shouldn't say considered to be a great scholar, but he wasn't honored in that fashion, I should say, right? But people didn't really pay attention to him. And our teachers tell us that, my own teacher was narrating this from his teacher, that our Allama Tabatabai, he would come and walk in the city of Najaf, and he would come, the city of Qom. He would walk in the alleys in the city of Qom, and we would see him sometimes. And it wasn't like there was any crowd following him. But now you look at his work, and it's unbelievable. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, when people don't follow him with a crowd, it doesn't mean he's not known in the skies, doesn't mean he's not known in the heavens, because in the heavens, as he is writing with his qalam or writing with his pen, every time he gets up to write something, the sound of that pen is making its way to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether people hear it or don't hear it, that's a separate thing. Whether there are crowds following him or not, that's a separate thing, right? And this really is a point to remember, that just because there is no crowd following someone doesn't necessarily mean what they're bringing to the table is not valuable, right? What Allama Tabatabai has brought to the table is so valuable, the Muslim Ummah still doesn't know what he has done. They still don't know. Like, Al-Mizan is still a hidden gem to a lot of people, right? But just because it wasn't well known doesn't mean it wasn't valuable, right? It was one of the greatest gems that we've had and that we will have, inshallah, for the future of the Muslim Ummah. Whether you're Shia or Sunni, this applies, I would say, because the opinions and the gems that are in there are tafsir of Quran, and therefore they would help any Muslim, essentially. But just because people don't gather around someone doesn't mean that, this person, his work is not valuable. On the flip side, just because someone someone has a crowd, right, that gathers around them, that doesn't mean that their work is very valuable either. It doesn't work like that. Having said that, that's the first sound. The second sound, وَوَتْيُ أَقْدَامِ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ, and those who are defending themselves, right, they're defending Muslim lands. When they walk, the sound that their feet make, this is the second sound that makes its way towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the third one was صَوْتُ مَغَازِلْ الْمُحْسِنَاتِ, and the sound of the sewing of the chaste women. A woman who is, she's modest, right, and she's working in her house. This is the sound that makes its way towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A mother or a woman who's working for the betterment of her family. This is, as we have in the ahadith, وَجَهَادُ الْمَرْأَةِ حُسْنُ التَّبَعُّلِ. The jihad of a woman is the way that she goes about managing her life, managing her spouse, managing the relationships within the house. These are the three sounds that make their way towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, this is qalam. Now, why is qalam so important? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of qalam, and we're talking about qalam and the concept of it, and it's really good and all that, but qalam is so critical to Islam that has made Islam different from every single other major religion that you have out there in the world. Why is that? See, what every other religion came about, some of them are completely lost in history, right? That we don't even know about. For example, the book of, that Dawood alayhi salam brought to us. Do we have that? We don't have that, for example. It's completely lost in history. We just know that he had a book, right? But we don't know what it is or where it is or anything like that. Then you have books in history that essentially, even if they made their way into being written, they weren't preserved over time. They were altered and essentially lost afterwards. And what we have from them today is just some reports from them, right? The Old Testament, the New Testament would fall under this category, where it's just essentially the overall message is said to be inspired by what Isa alayhi salam did and said. But in reality, is it the book of Isa alayhi salam? Of course not, right? Even from a historical perspective, you don't even have a shot of proving that. Not that you can't prove it. You don't have a shot at proving that, right? So then you have that. But when it comes to the Quran, what makes the Quran and Islam so special is that Islam was able to preserve itself for one reason and one reason only. And that one reason was because it had a book in the Quran that was preserved. Okay? And the reason why it was preserved is that the moment the Prophet would speak of these verses of the Quran, there were a group of people who would start to write down this Quran. Yes, there were hundreds and thousands that would memorize the verses of the Quran, but there's nothing like al-qalam. There's nothing like when you take these verses that are in the chests of people and you start to write this down. So when you look in history, you find the Prophet had a close-knit circle of people, a close group of people who were known as Kutabul Wahi. They were known as the people who were writing a revelation. So when a verse of the Quran or surah of the Quran was revealed upon the Prophet, he would go to the circle of Kutabul Wahi. He would dictate these verses upon them. They would write it down. They would show it to him, and then he would approve the writing of these verses. That is why we have this Quran today, which is why you have the religion of Islam still preserved today. Otherwise, what would have happened to Islam would have been the same thing that happened to Christianity and Judaism. What happened to Christianity? Some guy called Paul came along and said, listen, this, Isa alayhi salam, you don't have to really follow him. As long as you accept him as your savior, you're good to go. How did he come up with that? How was he able to pull that off? He was able to pull that off because you have no other measure to take and gauge what he's saying, right? In Islam, if I come across you and I say there's two gods, the first thing you'll say is, no, I recite Surah Ikhlas, it says, Qul huwallahu ahad. I recite Surah Ikhlas, it says there's one God. You have a Quran to gauge everything by. But in Christianity, you didn't have that, and that's why anyone can come by and come up with their own interpretation of what this religion is supposed to be about. You can come up with the idea that Isa alayhi salam was a son of God. Who's going to stop you? There is nothing to have your words and your opinion gauged by. Whereas in Islam, you have that. And yes, there's dispute about what is this Quran talking about, and what is the exact interpretation of this verse and what is it referring to. There's a lot of talk about that, of course. But at the end of the day, you have a measuring stick that you can go by. And that measuring stick is only there because of al-qalam. It's only there because the Prophet had made it a habit that whenever he would recite these verses, that these verses would be written down. Now, when you look into history, this group of Kutabul Wahi, this group of people who would write down the revelations of the Prophet, there is dispute as to how many people were amongst this group. Some have said 10, some have said up to 45, but the 3 or 4 people that there's no dispute that they were amongst that core group of Kutabul Wahi are these individuals. Number 1, Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wasalamuhu alayhi. Number 2, Ubay ibn Ka'b. Number 3, Zayd ibn Thabit. And number 4, Zayd ibn Arqam. Now these guys are companions of the Prophet. Of course, they've played roles in different places in the life of the Prophet, right? Ali ibn Abi Talib, of course, we know of very well. Ubay ibn Ka'b has been there. Zayd ibn Thabit has been there. And Zayd was the same person that later on played a role in the compilation of the Quran. And Zayd ibn Arqam was there as well. He lived until the time of the third Imam. He was the one who opposed Yazid la'natullahi alayhi when he was disrespecting the head of Abu Abdullah in his courtyard. Zayd ibn Arqam, companion of the Prophet, he was one of those who objected to what Yazid la'natullahi alayhi was doing. This is the role of qalam. This is why Islam has been able to preserve itself. Some people, and of course this is a long discussion, but I'm not going to go into detail about this, but I will say this. Some people have this common misunderstanding that the Quran was compiled during the time of the third Khalifa. This is a very dangerous thought. This is a very dangerous thing to believe, okay? Because if you say the Quran was essentially compiled years after the Prophet passed away, then you are opening up the Quran to so much alteration. You are opening up the Quran to so many mistakes. From a historical perspective, from the perspective of the Quran, we know that it hasn't been changed. We know that it's a miracle. But from a historical perspective, I say that. And furthermore than that, that's not even true. The Quran was compiled, first of all, during the time of the first Khalifa, right, for the time of Abu Bakr. And at the same time, we know that Ali ibn Abi Talib also compiled the Quran on his own. So this idea that, yes, Uthman came and he did the compilation of the Quran, this is not correct. And like I said, it will open up the door. Essentially, you're opening a can of worms when you say Uthman was the first one to have the Quran written down, for example, or to have the Quran compiled. What we believe is the Quran was written down during the time of the Prophet, while he was alive, with this group of Kutab al-Wahy that he had. And then beyond that, it was compiled and put together in one book by Abu Bakr. And the person that he put in charge of being able to compile the Quran was Zayd ibn Thabit, who was a young man, but because he was a part of the group of Kutab al-Wahy, the first and second Khalifa put him in charge of this. Now, how did he go about doing that? That's a longer discussion. But this is when the Quran was compiled from the perspective of the general public within the Muslim world. And at the same time, we know that Ali ibn Abi Talib had made it a task upon himself to compile the Quran before he left his house after the Prophet had passed away. All of this, brothers and sisters, I said, because this is what makes Islam so special. No other religion out there has a book as solid as the Quran that has been written down so closely to the time of its revelation. Some major religions in the world, like Hinduism and Buddhism, they don't really have a book to show in the sense of, from a historical perspective, you could trace it back to the person who brought that religion. Of course, they have their books, but you can't trace it back to that time. And also with Judaism and Christianity, you find the same thing, right? Where you can't trace it back to who wrote this book. They say the Old Testament was the book of Musa alayhi salam. Can you prove that from a historical perspective? No, you have no shot. In fact, what you can prove is that it had 4 different writers, 4 different styles in there. This is what makes Islam so special. And that's why, when our youth ask and our younger generation asks, how can I know Islam is the true religion out there, right? How can I know that this is the religion I'm supposed to follow? I only have one question for them all the time. I say, well, which other religion are you going to follow? Because the other religions don't even give you a book to work with. At least Islam gives you a book to work with, right? Where a book where you can at least, have a shot at tracing it back to who brought the religion historically. With other religions, what other religion? There is no other religion that will give you at least a book to work with. This is what makes Islam special. And this all comes from the concept of al-qalam. Okay, I elaborated on that a little bit more than I wanted to. But inshallah, we will move on from that, and we'll move on with the rest of the topic. I'm just gonna check to see if we have any questions, and then we will move on. All right. So one question is saying, what's the difference between Musafir ilallah and Mujahid ilallah? I'm not sure what that question is referring to. So if you can explain your question a little bit more in depth, inshallah, I will get to that. And on the YouTube, I don't see any questions. And I also don't see any questions on the Instagram. I see statements on the Instagram, but I don't see any questions on the Instagram. So we'll move on, inshallah. So, Nun wal qalami wa ma yasturun. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is swearing by qalam to prove what? To prove ma anta bi ni'mati rabbika bi majnoon. Ya Rasulullah, they keep calling you crazy. You're not crazy. One of the reasons why Sha'n al-Nuzul says that the people of Quraysh were calling the Prophet crazy is because of the attention he was giving to Ali alayhi salam. And they were jealous because of this. And because of that, they started to call the Prophet crazy. وَإِنَّ لَكَ لَأَجْرًا غَيْرَ مَمْنُونَ. And for you, Ya Rasulullah, is a reward that is غَيْرُ مَمْنُونَ. Man, right? When we say minnat in Arabic, or in, we have it in Farsi as well. This is different from mannat that we have with our, in Urdu. Minnat has two meanings. Minnat, sometimes it refers to the idea of you taking a blessing and reminding someone that you gave them that blessing. Sometimes it refers to cutting off something. So when the Quran says وَإِنَّ لَكَ لَأَجْرًا غَيْرَ مَمْنُونَ, it's saying you will have a reward that will never be cut off. Right? You will have a reward that is unlimited. It will continue to give. You also find this at the end of, or in the middle of Surah Al-Duha. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْتِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will continue to give to you from His blessings in this world and the next until you are satisfied, Ya Rasulullah. Similar message and similar theme is coming up here. وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ. And you surely are living and have this great akhlaq of yours. Okay. When the Quran calls something azim, it's really azim. It's not something small. When we call something big, we call everything big sometimes, right? But the Quran, when it calls it something azim, when it calls it great, that means it's really great. That means even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in my words, of course, God is not a human, but in my words, He is even surprised at how great the akhlaq of the Prophet is, right? He is even showing significance to this. Not that He's surprised. Of course, He'll never be surprised with anything. Why is this? Because we read in the verses of the Quran that if the Prophet was able to pull off this idea of bringing people towards the religion of Islam, of bringing people to a point where they could listen and hear to the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they were able to do this because of the good akhlaq of the Prophet. Because of the akhlaq of the Prophet that would bring people closer to him. So we read in verse 159 of Surah Al Imran, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ. It was because we blessed you, and because of that blessing, you became lenient with the people. وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْغَلْبِ. But if you were the type who had a very hard heart, then لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. They would have left you. And this shows us, brothers and sisters, us who consider ourselves practicing Muslims and put this title of Muslim upon ourselves, the key here is to remember that if you and I, even if what we're saying is true, right, and if what we're bringing to the table has meaning to it, at the end of the day, if you don't have good akhlaq, your message is not going to go anywhere. It doesn't matter what you're doing, doesn't matter what you're saying, because the Quran is telling even the Prophet that it is because of your good akhlaq that people came around you. Otherwise, لَنْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ. Otherwise, they would have left you. So that means, this shows the importance of having good akhlaq, even if what you're saying is true, even if what you're saying is right. Now, the ahadith that we have about having good akhlaq is, I would say, unbelievable, because there are so many of them. And the wording that you find in these ahadith really show you that the idea of having good akhlaq, it's no small feat. It's no small achievement if someone can have good akhlaq. That's why I always say that if someone wants to, go on the spiritual journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, for fancier terms, we would call it wayfaring towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Someone wants to do this, it all starts from your akhlaq. It all starts from your akhlaq, specifically from the way, the akhlaq that you have with the people who are the closest to you. It's easy, brothers and sisters, to have good akhlaq with the person that you see once a month. It's easy to have good akhlaq with strangers. It's easy to have good akhlaq with people that you don't have to deal with day in and day out. It's difficult to have good akhlaq with the people that you see every single day, right? And you know what I'm talking about. It's difficult to have good akhlaq with your spouse who brought up the same issue that she brought up or he brought up like 10 times before, bringing it up again. That's when it's difficult to have good akhlaq, right? And it's difficult to have good akhlaq with a parent who brought up the same issue with you because you see that parent every single day. And dare I say, it is very difficult to have good akhlaq when that child of yours does something that you told him not to do for the past 20 days of Ramadan, still he's doing it on the 21st day of Ramadan. As a difficult things to do. Good akhlaq, what you find good akhlaq of in our society is good akhlaq with strangers. That's easy. It's easy to smile when you're holding the door for someone that you have never known. You don't know their flaws. You don't have to deal with them every day. And it's not bad. It's still good. But that's the easy part. The difficult part is. The difficult part is when you're dealing with someone every single day and you have to deal with their flaws every single day and their habits every single day. Are you going to have good akhlaq in those situations? That's the test, and that is one of those things that going through the night of Qadr, we can take away, inshallah, and we can implement into our lives. وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ فَسَتُبْصِرُ وَيُبْصِرُونَ. You will see and they will see. Okay, بِأَيِّكُمُ الْمَفْتُونَ. Which one of you guys is lost? No, you're not lost, they're lost. إِنَّ رَبَّكَ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ ضَلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِالْمُهْتَدِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows who is on the right path and who is completely misguided. Now, from verse 8 onwards, it's going to move on to a separate topic. Up until here, it was comforting the Prophet. From verse 8 onwards, it's now going to talk about how the Prophet needs to be careful that when they come to him, when people who are rich come to him, when people who are influential come to him, that he won't compromise on the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Verse 9, وَدُّوا لَوْ تُدْهِنُ فَيُدْهِنُونَ, has a very, very critical message. You don't compromise when these people come to you and they ask you to compromise. What's the story behind this verse? Inshallah, we'll move on. We'll have this in the next session. But what's the story behind this verse, number one? Number two, how does that apply to our lives today? Are there situations where we compromise on our principles? Are there situations where we're trying to fit in? And because of that, we are willing to give away, auction off certain aspects of Islam. I'll give you some real life examples of that, inshallah, next session when we discuss this. Because this is a serious issue that we have, where people will have an appearance of a person who is practicing Islam, but then at every turn, they will sell away a certain aspect of Islam in order to fit in more and more with what the mainstream ideology in the societies that we live in today demand of them. That's a serious problem that we have. Mainly because they have an Islamic appearance, and that therefore you and I are not able to tell that what this person is preaching is not really mainstream Islam. It's not really a full picture of Islam. No, there's some parts of it from Islam, other parts of it he's selling off and he's auctioning away so that he can have that attention, he can have that attraction and fit in with others. We'll discuss that inshallah in the next session. Again, I'm just going to check. All right, so the brother's explaining his question: one who leaves his place for Allah and return back to home after some time, and one leaves home for Allah and never returns. Well, that's the difference between them, as you just mentioned. Of course, they're both rewarded, right? But that's essentially the difference between them. How to overcome evil character with good one? Okay, unfortunately, I'm again a little confused as to what that question is referring to, but essentially what I'm understanding from that is if someone has some evil in their character, how are you supposed to deal with them? There's two ways to do it, right? Either you're just patient and you ignore them, or you completely distance yourself from them. Those are the only two ways to go about it, essentially. All right, I don't see any more questions here. Shaykh, what does it mean by the left hand and right hand? These lines in the Quran come in a lot of chapters. I don't think... Okay, so we didn't go through the right hand and the left hand, but... So what the Quran, when it says the right hand, sometimes what it refers to is referring to servants and maids. And we know that the Quran, this was an issue that the Muslims dealt with at that time, and then over time, Islam was able to eradicate this practice from the Muslim community. The way Islam went about this issue of servants and maids, right, and essentially changed the whole atmosphere is, of course, a separate discussion. But in brief, what Islam did is it introduced rights for these individuals in the first step. And this was a big deal because at that time, when you were a servant or a maid, you had zero rights. Islam came into the picture. First of all, it introduced rights for these individuals. Second of all, there were certain duties that were wajib upon the owner of a maid that was not wajib upon the maid herself or the servant himself. That was the second thing that Islam did, burdening those who own rather than those who are owned. And then the third thing that Islam did, which essentially eradicated this whole idea, is that Islam brought about this approach where a lot of sins that you commit and a lot of deeds that you do, in order to be able to benefit from them, in order to benefit from these rewards or to have your sins forgiven, you would have to free individuals. So you find this in the seerah of the Prophet. You also find this in the seerah of Islamic history over time. And that's how essentially this practice left Islam over time. So when it says the right hand or what your right hand owns, sometimes it's referring to that idea. Other times, depending on the situation, al-yamin, the right hand, would be referring to a different meaning. It depends sometimes, right? When the Quran says لَأَخَذْنَاهُ بِالْيَمِينِ, we will get the Prophet by our right hand, sometimes it means with strength, for example. So other times it will have other meanings. Okay, inshallah, ashab on the right side and ashab on the left side in Surah Waqi'ah. Yeah, the right side and left side, of course, on that day it refers to the idea of the good and the bad. So that again is a different meaning that the Quran is referring to. Please, can you tell the reference of tafsir? So this is from tafsir of Allama Tabatabai, from Al-Mizan, Surah Qalam, and tafsir of Ayatul Makarim Shirazi, tafsir Nimuna. Inshallah. Thank you very much for being with us. We will continue tomorrow with the session. For those who are not subscribed to the podcast, you can go ahead and do that on any of the main podcast platforms that we have. There's also a Mizan Sustainers Club that is up on the Facebook page. We don't believe too much in doing fundraising and things of that nature, but we do believe in sustaining the projects that are being done. So inshallah, if you're able to and you've benefited from the work of Mizan Institute, then inshallah you can consider that as well. As you see on the page, there's the Q code for the QR code for the podcasts, and you can just scan that with your phone and it will take you directly to those podcasts, inshallah. Thank you very much for being with us. Tomorrow, inshallah, we'll continue with the tafsir of Suratul Qalam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa